Seems to be going through well.
Yep. I have consented.
It's going, right?
Yep.
Okay. So it understood that this is an important panel and decided not to give us trouble. Good morning to the YouTube community. If you're watching us, we decided to go live a couple minutes earlier to make sure that we're ready to go on time with this very exciting panel that we will be hosting today. Good morning. Okay. I think I'll get started slowly, but to get us all in motion. It's already 11 o'clock in New York. We are here from colleagues for whom it is 8 p.m. in India, Rag. One of our panelists is joining us at 4:30 in the morning from Hawaii. Welcome you all to another fine meeting, and a fine meeting it is. I think we have a fantastic panel. What I'd like to do is to give you an outline of how we're going to run the panel so that you know what to expect during the next couple of hours. Before doing that, and so that we allow some of our colleagues who may join us in a couple of minutes, let me just very quickly remind you of what we're going to have next week. So as we normally do, next week we have...
We're returning next week.
Next week we have Damian Farin, and I forgot to open the announcement, but so that you know, he'll be talking about behavioral ecology of birds. Today what we have is an animal behavior and conservation panel. And what I'm going to do now is very briefly, because you have it on the screen, introduce our four panelists: Oded Berger-Tal from the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel, Dan Blumstein from the University of California, Los Angeles, USA, Alison Greggor from San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance in the USA, and John Swaddle, William and Mary in the USA. And they will be in charge of running the panel. What we plan on doing is the following. Let me just quickly show you the outline for today's meeting. So I've just done it slowly. There we go. I've just very briefly introduced the panelists. They will now introduce themselves because we decided that nobody could do a better job than they can in introducing and describing why they belong in this panel. Let me just say that I'm so impressed by the panel that Lauren Hayes, our colleague and co-organizer of FIND, has put together. It would be a challenge to find a set of 4 colleagues who so beautifully, so thoroughly combine, intersect the fields of conservation biology and behavioral ecology. And they really cover a range of expertise, some of them leaning more to the conservation biology applied side of the spectrum, others very much doing behavioral ecology. So they'll introduce themselves in some detail so that you know them. And then for the rest of the first hour of the meeting, that means through noon, New York time, they will be addressing 3 of 6 questions that we share with them ahead of time that were contributed by ourselves and students Lindelani Makuya, Siga Zangweni, and Thomas Barada. students who have been actively participants in the fine. When we finish at noon, they will finish discussing the questions we have given them. And like we always do at fine, we will open now the conversation to everyone in the audience, both joining us via Zoom or watching the panel through the YouTube channel. At that time, you'll be able to ask questions by typing a question mark in the chatting pane. If you're a student, I encourage you to type an S because you get priority over senior colleagues who would like to ask a question as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and invite our panelists to introduce themselves. I'd like to start with Dan. You're first on my screen, so please, if you can go ahead and tell us a little bit about why you are in this panel.
Thanks, Eduardo. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This should be fun. I'm Dan Blumstein. I'm a professor at UCLA. I'm in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and also our Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. From the first days when I was a grad student, I was fascinated about behavior, but I also was sort of seeing the world around me changing and recognizing that, conservation science, at that time I called it conservation biology, is something I also wanted to get involved in. So I sort of drilled down and asked proximate mechanism questions and ultimate questions into Bergian science for my PhD, but also worked in a place where I could learn about conservation and work in international wildlife conservation. This was in the Karakoram Mountains in Pakistan. For one of my postdocs, I studied basically the evolution of language in marmots. I'm interested in animal behavior. I'm interested in communication and social behavior and anti-predator behavior. And I think that many of these things have implications for demography. And I think that therefore that's a link immediately to thinking about conservation. But really it was a third postdoc in Australia where I really began sitting down and finally beginning to put these ideas together and trying to move things forward. And, a lot of my career has different paths, but these days I'm working with Alison and Oded and John, developing something we call the Integrated Conservation Clinic, which we may talk about later on. But I think there's a lot that people who do Tinbergian behavior potentially have to contribute to conservation, but it sort of requires a different mindset. And I think that's going to come out in some of our discussions and answering these questions over the next hour or so.
Thank you, Dan. Alison, please.
Good morning, evening, and everything in between to everyone. Thank you, Eduardo, and the entire organizing group for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our discussions today. I come from a background in animal cognition and learning. I did my PhD working with birds in the corvid family, and I was fascinated about animal minds and looking at the difference between urban and rural environments. But really, I was focused on more of that implication side of things, thinking about how what we know about cognition could influence conservation in theory. And after a short postdoc, I realized that I didn't want to be more in the academic realm. I really wanted to be on the application side of things. And so I was very fortunate to be able to join the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, working initially with the Hawaiian crow and reintroduction programs there so that I could actually apply what I knew about corvids in a real world scenario where we were trying to breed birds and give them the survival skills that they needed to survive in the wild. Since then, I've continued with the organization and I now work on a number of different projects, which I feel very fortunate to be able to work with animals as small as the Pacific pocket mouse, North America's smallest mammal, all the way up to doing some consulting work with elephants. And so it really, a lot of the learning mechanisms and some of the fundamentals of behavior can apply across an incredible range of species. And I'm very fortunate in my work that I get to actually do research that has a tangible application and get to see that in practice. And so it's a little bit of a different model from the academic world, but many of the same principles apply. So I'm really excited to speak with you all more about that today.
Thank you, Alison. John?
Hey, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. I'm John Swaddle. I'm a biologist at William & Mary. Like everybody else on this panel, I have a rooting in sort of behavioral ecology. My way into that was thinking about animal communication and sensory biology. And that's really carried forward to today. The work that I do now in applied areas, and especially in conservation, I feel like part of my job is to represent the wildlife and to try to see and hear and taste the world from the wildlife's point of view, and to make sure that their voice is heard in the conservation solutions that you could generate. So my career has sort of merged towards very applied work recently over the last decade or so. And now I co-run a conservation institute at my university where we take a very integrated view of what conservation is. I wouldn't even describe myself as a biologist anymore. I would describe myself as a humanistic social scientist, I think. And I've sort of recognized that applied conservation, the practice of conservation, is more about people necessarily than it is about the wildlife. And the work that we do is very centered on humans, that all the conservation solutions that we work towards address aspects of human well-being, health, job opportunities, economic opportunities, and also make sure that voices are heard, that the communities where the conservation action is taken are fully represented in all aspects of the process, from conceiving what the issues are to designing the studies, to collecting data, analyzing, interpreting it, and especially in terms of implementing solutions. The end is to improve outcomes for the wildlife as well, but if you don't do it with people in mind, then the actions are going to fail ultimately. And so that work has really stretched me into lots of different areas of what I sort of say is broadly interpreted behavioral science, beyond animals, well, non-human animals, to be thinking about humans as being a really important part of the equation for conservation solutions in the end.
Thank you, John. Oded?
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'm Oded Berger-Tal, and I'm a researcher in Ben-Gurion University on the Negev in Israel. And as Dan, Alison, and John, I started as a behavioral ecologist in my early career, but I think already during my PhD, I realized that what I want to do is conservation behavior, is apply an understanding of animal behavior to conservation. And I think that's one of the main things we'll discuss. It means much more than just choosing research questions that may be relevant. It's a whole change. It could be a whole change in approach. And it's how you do science, who you talk to, where you go to find your questions, et cetera, et cetera. So with this in mind, actually, my postdoc I did with Dan and with Ron Swaysgood in San Diego Zoo, which is now Wildlife Alliance. So everything connects. And I started to be a researcher here. I have my own lab about 7 years ago, 7.5 years, almost 8 years ago. And research in my lab is focused on conservation behavior, various aspects of issues. All of them have conservation applications, come from the conservation world. The need for them come from the people doing conservation, but the understanding of animal behavior and using methods from animal behavior science is used to answer the questions and get solutions. So just examples of topics, research topics in my lab. So impacts of noise pollutions on animals, songbirds in particular, and finding ways to mitigate that, the impact. Impacts of nature-based tourism on animals. And again, how can we manage it in a way that will minimize the disturbance to animal and animal behavior? Behavior mitigation or behavioral management of conservation translocations, behavior management of human-wildlife conflict. In this case, behavior management basically means both animals and humans, as John said, and et cetera, things like that.
Thank you, Oded. So for those of you who maybe joined us only a couple of minutes ago, let me just remind you what we're planning on doing next. So we have now covered point 2, which the panelists introduce themselves. What we're going to do now is ask each of the panelists to address 3 of the 6 questions that were contributed by us and some students who regularly participate with us. So these are the questions that we're going to try to address. We have decided with the panelists that we want to keep it very engaging, very interactive. So we'll see how many of these questions we tackle, but we definitely want to get started. And so we'll start with question 1, which is going to be first addressed by Alison. And question 1 reads, what can I, as a behavioral biologist, do to contribute to conservation successes?
Thank you, Eduardo. I think in this case, the I very much depends on who you are, what stage of your career you're in. This is something that Dan, Oded, John, and a number of colleagues and I sat down to think about. How do we better integrate the field of animal behavior with conservation? And we came up with some 4 themes that apply depending on your career stage. So let's say you're a student. And you're still really learning about conservation, you're still training in your own development in your career. And we really, really encourage people to think just beyond taking a conservation biology class, but thinking about what are the other skills you're going to need to do conservation, because conservation isn't just academic knowledge. You need to have interpersonal skills. You need to have the soft skills that allow you to interface with a much more dynamic and complex set of partners and stakeholders that might be involved in any conservation project you are a part of. And so if you're a student, now is the time to really try and get some of those skills. We'd also recommend trying to think about how to make sure your research can be applied. As a student, you're not necessarily determining all aspects of your research, so find a mentor who is really engaged on that crossover between your interested discipline and conservation biology. So that could be behavior and conservation. It could be social sciences and conservation. It could be whatever your focus is overlapping with conservation. And we'd also highly encourage people to get involved with their networks. So building relationships between folks that are not necessarily in academia. There's some excellent wildlife society conferences where there are opportunities for students to come and meet people who work in the fields that you might be interested in, and really get to know folks beyond your academic mentor circle. And then also we think about how the work that you do can be better communicated. So most conservation practitioners are not spending their days reading academic articles. There are certainly some on occasion that are able to, but really a lot of conservation knowledge gets absorbed through other means, more easily digestible formats, because a lot of conservationists are really busy and trying to come up with ways to distill any outcomes of your research into an easily communicable method, be it on Twitter or with short little explanations of what you're doing, do a blog or a podcast. These are all ways to help explain why your science matters. I don't know, Dan, John, or Oded, if you have anything you want to add to that. I just breezed through that thinking about from a student perspective, because I imagine there's quite a lot of students in the audience.
I would add that, Alison sort of mentioned this, but, when you have a conservation or wildlife management problem, there's a problem. Someone is tasked to solve that problem, and it's probably not us. And it's really important to make those connections with the people who have the problems, so that you have relationships with people, so that you become a trusted person that maybe they can go to. And certain colleagues have been very successful at that. And by having these relationships, then maybe there is a behavioral insight that can be useful. Maybe there isn't. It's not about applying behavior, it's about solving a problem. So sort of flipping the whole question to, making relationships with people that have local, regional, national, international oversight for managing various problems, I think is an effective way to sort of translate, insights you may have into conservation action.
I really agree with what Dan and Alison are saying about relationship building across the different sectors that you want to influence. Ultimately, actions taken by people, and people listen to other people. So the more that you can develop personal relationships and professional relationships with actual practitioners, the communities that you want to influence with your work, the better, because they will listen to you. You'll become a trusted collaborator and partner in the work. And you'll also get insight into what makes them tick. What are their incentives? Why do they make decisions to implement things? It's not always because they perceive this as to be the highest quality science. It's not always that. There are many other things that factor into the day-to-day decision-making of what a person on the ground is going to do in terms of conservation action. So what can you do to develop those relationships? I think, again, it depends on career stage, but even if you're a student, you might be able to go to conferences that you can meet people at, like Alison was saying. You might also be able to host people at your institution. So think about it in terms of opportunities to host speakers or seminars or guest lecturers or whatever it is, and try to get some conservation practitioners into your academic community and just listen to them. Try to be in their boots a little bit and think about day-to-day activities and decision-making that they have to make. And that might give you some insight into how you can make a positive impact on the work that they're doing and the goals that they have, as Dan was saying.
I think of course, we'll merge, we're gonna leaking into the second question as well, but these questions are connected, of course. And so just adding to that, also different career stages, so not necessarily students, you can, of course, if you know what you want to do early enough, you can choose your mentor and choose somebody who's doing conservation work or is involved in conservation work. But even just as everybody said, just choose the people you talk to, or just find people to talk to that understand conservation needs. But later on, I know that when I returned to Israel with the idea of opening, a lab center on conservation behavior, one of the first things I did is go to the INPA, Israel Nature Parks Authority, go to each regional ecologist. Israel is small, so you can do that and cover Israel, each one within its own scale, and start by asking them, what are the major problems you're facing? What information you need? What solution do you need? And of course, many of these were not necessarily relevant to what I can offer or can do, but many were. And this already set the stage for what research will I begin with when I start the lab. So, the conversation, the dialogue from the start with the people actually doing conservation and understanding what they need is, I think, the key.
I don't know if it was Alison, but I was thinking that something, as I'm listening to you, I was thinking that something that's very, very realistic for students to do, addressing your suggestions, is to consider the committee composition of a dissertation committee, because if at that time you invite some of these people, we all need some structure to make things happen, right? So you were suggesting go invite speakers or go to colloquia. But if some of you decide that you want to have somebody conservation oriented within your committee, that guarantees you presence, that guarantees you exposure to that kind of discipline. Would you say that's an easy one? I think it's low hanging fruit, but it's realistic, I think. Anyone can do that.
And I would recommend, if somebody does, I think it's a great suggestion, that they try and make sure that that person is involved from the point of forming questions as well, not later in the research process when things are already moving, you already know what you want to do, you've already started collecting data. Really, how you form and think about what questions you are trying to address may very well differ if you're thinking about that problem that Dan was mentioning. What is that problem that your research is going to actually address? And it can really be differences in scale. It can be just differences of what types of control conditions you might consider relevant for your study. And there's some beautiful examples of blending really, really applicable work that can be applied in a conservation setting while still pushing forward theory and still being able to get a deeper understanding of the mechanism of behavior that's ongoing at that time. It's hard to do, to combine both. but it is possible, and having that insight early on in forming a dissertation could be really helpful.
I think with that in mind, it is important to acknowledge that this may be a challenge, and it's really depending on the institution you are in and the department you're in, and something in the mentor you have, etc. It will determine how much of a challenge it is. But in general, trying to do an academic dissertation, PhD, or a master's with academic goals will not always perfectly fit to the need, or in many cases, it won't perfectly fit to the needs of conservation practitioners, to the questions they need to be answered, which a lot of time are not novel enough, or the system is not compatible with the classic academic setup. So as a PI, you have more control over that. As a student, not necessarily. So in some situation, in some institution, it will be easier to get the conservation context into your research. In some, it will be more challenging, but there's no set amount that is needed. The idea is that you want to do more in conservation. So within the framework of that you deal with, the more you're involved, the more you can push toward the conservation, the better, or the more conservation outcomes you will get, or the more information that can be maybe applied you will get. But of course, again, it can be a challenge, and depending where you are, it may take some effort. Let's say that's the.
I'd like Dan, if we can, let's make sure, because we talked about this before we started the panel, like everyone. So let's be sure that we move. So the second, I'd like to suggest that we address the second question for a little while, which reads, how can we effectively communicate the findings of animal behavior studies to policymakers, the public, and local communities? John, would you like to get started on this one, and then we'll hear from the other panelists?
Yeah, and it's very related to, I think, some of the answers that have already been given. I think to think about effective communication, you need to know your audience. So understanding who it is that you are trying to communicate with, and for what purpose, and why that information that you can offer to those people is valuable and important. So to be able to communicate effectively, I think we come back to some of the same issues of relationship building, and making sure that you know what you need to communicate and why that's going to be valuable to those people, and then you can think about questions about what format that is delivered in, because different audiences are going to rely on different kinds of formats. Of course, as academics, we tend to lean back onto the classic sort of manuscript style way of reporting things. But as Alison was saying in her intro, in conservation, very few people are reading primary literature articles, certainly all the way through. So you need to think about ways in which you can distill information into simpler formats that are shorter, more easily digestible, and more easily actionable in the ways that make sense for that particular audience. Part of this question is also, it kind of implies that you've done some work and now you're trying to communicate it. I think also, if you're in that stage, then perhaps you need to, for the next project, think about more of a co-design process where you get to know the community that you want to influence, and you start talking to them very early in the conception of the project, so you can understand that the objectives that are baked into the project are actually meeting the needs that that particular audience wants and cares about. That's hard as a student. That's really hard especially a graduate student, because you don't have the time to do that. You might not have the access to those audiences. So I would say, in an answer to this question and in the previous question, be patient. Be patient with yourself in terms of developing your skill sets and your experience. And there will be times when you don't influence conservation, but there will be times to come when you do influence conservation practice of some kind. So don't be too hard on yourself if you're earlier in your career. I think a lot of people have gone through these struggles of wanting to have influence on processes, but you don't have the relationships, you don't quite have the experience to get the information out in the right type of way at the right time. But you will get there if you take the principles of sort of co-design and relationship building to heart, I think.
Thank you, John. Anybody would like to comment? Just be patient with yourself. I think that's probably, it's not just for students, right? I felt like you were talking to me. So anybody would like to add to what John said, any of the panelists?
I'll just say, first off, John, that was very well said. What you brought up there, I think, is a really important point, that there is no one definition of a conservationist. So the idea that there's this set track that everyone has to be on to be able to get to that goal of having application, that doesn't, at least from my experience, that doesn't exist. Anybody can come from many different fields and still contribute to conservation. It may not all be in the same way, but there are opportunities there if you can build those relationships to have your work be meaningful in settings outside of an academic context. So I think it's a really, being kind to yourself is some great advice there, because everyone's coming from different experiences, and those actually can be really valuable perspectives that you can bring to the table later on when you do have those relationships down the road.
Thank you, Alison. If I don't get any immediate reactions, I suggest we move on to the third question. How do field studies on movement behavior and technological advancements, for example, remote sensing and tracking devices, contribute to conservation? Oded, would you like to take on this one first?
Yes. So, I mean, movement, of course, is just one example of a behavior that is well studied and you know, from many different aspects, and that can be used in conservation. But I think it's a very good example because it highlights, I think, the various aspects of conservation behavior in several ways. First of all, it highlights why behavior can be very important. We didn't actually, we took that for granted. We didn't really speak about that, but behavior can be very useful for conservation. And the reason that in general, even beyond movement, is that to do effective conservation, and there's, you know, these days, we really need to do effective and efficient conservation. It's not enough to see patterns, to describe patterns and respond to them. In many cases, if you just describe patterns, you may get the wrong, or you sell on the wrong management intervention or a plan. And again, we don't have time to waste on wrong solutions these days. So the idea of behavior is to get is one of the ways to get the mechanism, to get the why, not just why these patterns are the way they are, which will help us do better conservation. So in terms of movement, again, it's classic. So movement can be used and is used a lot for designing, for example, conservation corridors or protected areas, or managing how translocated individuals or populations succeed. But again, if you just use patterns, presence, absence, and various, even if you take movement ecology, but don't try to look at the mechanistic, at the behavior, the why, what you will probably get is the wrong corridor, or the wrong, or they're not efficient enough, let's say, reserve design, etc., etc. So using movement ecology, movement behavior through the technological tools, through tracking devices, through remote sensing, through the various technological advances that we have these days, and we have plenty of them these days, to understand, and through the understanding of the life history of the different species, so through understanding of why actually animals move the way they do, the solution can be much more precise, tailored to what we need. So this is how why movement, I think, emphasize that very well. But also relating to what we said before, again, with all the fancy technology and so much data that we can get these days in the realm of movement ecology, we do as scientists create a lot of information that is either not useful for conservation, or maybe it's useful, but it's hiding under a lot of fancy jargon and really complicated and sophisticated analysis with no clear applications. So even here, or not even here, just as in other fields, it is really important to understand, okay, what do we need, and how can we use moving ecology to get to the problems that we, or to the information that we're seeking.
So one of the things that I like to think about a lot is, how do we integrate conservation behavior? How do fields change? How do ideas change? And movement ecology is one of these fields that just blew up out of nowhere. And Ran Nathan, I think, was very influential in this by sort of pushing this, but also these new techniques that can be used and are being used that create these big data sets, and wise people creating ways to share these data like MoveBank and things like that have created unprecedented big data that clearly tell us something. And I'm going to channel my inner Mark Beckoff here and say, but when we're studying movement, we're not really watching animals. We are, but we're not really watching animals. And I think we lose things when we interpolate big patterns of movement, which is not to say that insights from movement ecology and insights from these techniques can be very, very important for a variety of conservation problems, including, where are animals going? What times of the years are they going there? What areas do we need to protect? I mean, if you can map it, you can protect it, and understanding where animals move is a big part of that. So we have unprecedented new tools to do that now. But, it's not the only thing that's important. Other things are too. And, just because we have whiz-bang technology, I think that there is something, I'm putting on my ethologist hat now, that's gained by, watching animals and trying to understand how they're making decisions. And as John said earlier, being their representative, trying to see or perceive the world as they do. So I think that, movement's a great, important tool, but there are many important tools. And what I would like to really say is that there are all of these tools, and whether any of these tools is good for any question is an empirical question. And I think we have to, we will, move fields forward by coming up with structures to say, well, can this work in this situation or can't it? And asking the question. And sometimes you ask questions and, it doesn't work. So just as medicine has meta-analysis and systematic reviews to sort of estimate effect sizes of things, medicine also has comparative effectiveness evaluation. So just because something works, maybe its effect size is smaller, maybe it's too expensive. So when you start thinking about conservation, you're thinking about changing things, you're thinking about the application of knowledge, which to me is a really exciting question in general. And, can this be used for something? Is it too expensive? Is it cost effective to help solve the problem? I'll shut up.
Thank you, Dan. So just to be sure that I followed you, maybe the audience will benefit from my asking of this. So you're in a way saying that we also pay attention to what is needed. I think you emphasize that regardless of feasibility, then we will have, because if I understood what you're saying is, which is actually I was writing that question, well, we're doing a lot of movement now, but is it because we really identified it as such an important element, or is it because it's very feasible given technological advances? And I think you're encouraging us to really reflect on that. Don't lose sight of, first, we need to identify what is needed. We may realize that what's needed is not feasible. And were you kind of encouraging us to do that?
Well, I think that, movement is understanding movement in detail, that GPS trackers give you with sufficient resolution is useful for many management and conservation problems. And to answer a question that someone asked earlier, I know we're not answering questions, but I view conservation as conservation science, conservation biology is when we perceive we have too few of something, we want more of them. How do we increase population sizes? How do we reduce roadkill mortality, et cetera? Wildlife management, like that latter question goes into management, really is about, we perceive we have too much of something, or we have conflicts with animals. I would say hitting an animal with a car is a conflict. And that is, what can we do there? And I think these two things are related, but one is really about trying to increase population sizes of things by protecting habitat. Understanding where animals move and identifying habitat is essential. I mean, the whole field of movement ecology has shown us that some migratory ungulates, first, who realized that all these ungulates migrated, second, who realized they migrated in some cases over, through necks in the habitat that are maybe a few hundred meters wide. And they do this every year. And these corridors are incredibly important. Or understanding, as Oded said, how to link isolated patches with building corridors. That's all movement. So there's a suite of questions that can be asked of movement, but movement clearly isn't everything. And just big data approaches miss out sometimes, not always, sometimes on the nuances that actually can be important to sort of understand the world from animals' perspectives, as John was referring to earlier.
I wanted to add
Thanks, Don.
another little comment about just the use of technology in general, but it's very relevant for a lot of these movement ecology type of questions. There are still some human dimensions that people need to consider carefully too, as well, especially in terms of things like data sovereignty and justice issues related to the use of technology in locations. You might be capturing information that the people who live in those areas do not want to have shared or want to have influence on in terms of how it's used, especially if you start using, say, camera traps, acoustic monitoring, remote sensing. So thinking carefully about aspects of environmental justice and data sovereignty in your study design upfront, I would recommend people think about that. And it's not just about answering the question and getting the relevant information. It's about also working with the people who live on the land and may have lived there for a long, long time.
Thank you.
And one maybe last, depending on if Alison wants to say to chime in, but another point about movement, I think it's not unique to movement, but is more related to movement than other maybe behaviors, is that it's very scale dependent. So when you use movement to answer conservation questions or problems, the scale is critical. Because movement can mean the movement of an animal within like a 10-meter range or the migration across continent. Both of them are part of movement ecology. Both of them can be tracked quite with high resolution. But of course, they will, using this data set versus the other data set will give information that is useful for completely different problems or scenarios. One can be used to understand the behavior and the well-being maybe of individuals in a certain area that may be polluted, maybe not, maybe affected by disturbance. Another may be used to try to develop large-scale protected areas for migrating species, or for the scales, or understanding or relating the scale to the question is critical with movement.
Thank you, Oded. Should we move on to addressing question number 4? It asks that you give one empirical example from your studies on animal behavior that was implemented in conservation actions. And Dan, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll start with a process answer, and then John can talk about patents and really how that's actually worked. I've been fascinated by what happens when species lose predators, and they do this naturally when they find themselves isolated on islands. And we do this when we bring animals into captivity. So a chunk of my research has thought about, what happens when animals lose some or all predators. And there's a suite of hypotheses, and I've posited some of them that can explain in very mechanistic ways, whether anti-predator behavior persists, or the mechanisms by which predator naive animals can learn about predators, et cetera. So years ago, Andrea Griffin and Chris Evans and I were trying to train animals to, recognize predators. And Ian Jamieson sort of started this idea, and then we sort of expanded it a bit. And a number of years ago, a little over a decade ago, Catherine Mosby emailed me and said, well, I don't think this works. And I said, oh, why? She's like, well, I'm working in Australia and I have these animals, and we try to train them. They don't learn anything. I think you just have to throw, these animals in with predators and let God sort it out. And maybe it's learning, and maybe it's evolution and selection. And I said, I think that's unethical. We argued for about a month. And then she convinced me at the scale she was working, which was a huge fenced reserve called Arid Recovery, that, maybe this could work. And she and her husband had created this reserve, and they brought animals from predator-free islands. And these were endangered species that have been driven extinct on mainland Australia. Mainland Australia has experienced more mammalian extinctions, since European settlement than pretty much anywhere else in the world. And basically what we did is we designed an experiment, and we started having control populations, treatment populations, and had cats in some of them. Cats helped drive these animals extinct. And we had the populations grow a lot. So we showed that these animals can coexist with predators. And we were studying, are they learning anything? Is there selection? And, we found, we were looking at burrowing beddongs and bilbies. Ultimately, we then had these populations that were predator conditioned in some way. And then we said, okay, well, what happens if we put them in with predators? And for one species, the bilbies, the predator experienced bilbies did better. And for the beddongs, we tried this twice and they didn't do better. So this is sort of a failure and a success at some level, because we know that in some species, we can expose animals to low densities of predators for long periods of time. Their behavior will change, but so does their ability to survive with predators. And the challenge in Australia is introducing animals outside the fence. We failed because we never were able to get them living outside the fence, and we didn't even try because our partners weren't able to reduce predator populations to a level where we thought it would be reasonable to throw precious animals outside to see if it works. So it's sort of a work in progress. But I think that sort of shows how taking foundational knowledge about animal behavior, we've learned all sorts of stuff about relaxed selection and for any predator behavior and the effects of experience on changing behaviors, but then sort of thinking about this in the context of we need to sort of get these animals living with predators. And this actually is a solution to some extent, even in captive reserves, because when you have big captive reserves and you have no predators, the animal populations go up and they eat all the vegetation. So management of even fenced areas may ultimately in many contexts involve creating communities that have predators there. And the question is, how does this work? But John has actually had patents from his work and translates things in even more effective ways.
Yes, I could tell one anecdote to get into sort of the for-profit interactions with human-wildlife conflict and conservation. So I've been studying noise pollution for quite some time. I think some of the other people on this call actually study noise pollution too as well in some ways. And so we noticed, more than a decade or two ago, that in noisy situation, in this case, birds have difficulty hearing each other, and sometimes they can adjust how they call to accommodate that. And so in situations where it's really noisy, birds move away from those areas to seek out quieter places where they communicate with each other. So noticing that sort of fundamental behavioral observation from our own studies, but then many other studies too as well, we decided that, maybe a solution to trying to keep wildlife away from areas where they're being harmed or where they can cause harm could be to acoustically manipulate the environment. And so we tried a bunch of experiments where we deliberately introduced spatially controlled noise through very directional speakers that was designed to optimally mask communication channels between the wildlife. And when we did that, their state of fear skyrocketed. They started scanning for predators. They really didn't like being in the area, and they would move off to places where the sound wasn't being played. And because it was played through very directional speakers, we could create effectively a net of sound, which we patented into the Sonic Net, which is a product that you can now buy, to then produce an area that you can instantaneously change through behavioral mechanisms to be very sort of fear-ridden, and birds will move away and other wildlife will move away to other areas. So if you have, say, a tailings pond from a mining site or a polluted site that looks really nice in terms of the water and the vegetation, but is actually loaded with horrible pollutants, you can play this at that site and keep the birds away to protect the birds. You can also reduce conflict at airports where birds and airplanes are not a good combination for either. At crop fields where some birds will do damage, and you can protect crops at certain times of the year from species. And so this is sort of taking a fundamental behavioral observation and then turning it into an application that people needed. And then patenting that with the university, going into a commercialization phase with a company, and then trialing it in the field in different kind of commercial forms. So there are avenues. That's one avenue in a sort of for-profit way of positively influencing wildlife outcomes while also allowing for human economic activities within areas, which essentially is what conservation needs to do. In most places in the world, conservation issues are about conflict between economic activity for humans and the needs of the wildlife in some form. So if we can find solutions that balance the two better, and I think behavior has much to offer in that area.
Thank you, John. Yes, Oded, please.
First of all, I think this is the most fun question, of course, for everybody to answer, to find, examples of where the work has been used. And again, to connect it to what we talked before, I think one of the best way to ensure that your work will be used is to work on it from the start, from the people that will be the one using it. So in my example from my studies, so in Israel, the Israel Natural Parks Authority, from the name already, you can see it has two hats. It's a Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service in the same organization, but it means that it's in charge of both protecting nature, protecting habitats and wildlife, but also it's in charge of recreation and national parks and human recreation in nature, which is really important for conservation. And it's very well known that the more people are in nature, the more they're exposed, the more they care about conservation. But it also, and we know that from a lot of studies, it has costs in terms of conservation. People disturb, and the disturbance is within natural areas. So, from the start, when I was talking to people from the Israeli Natural Parks Authority, Israeli likes to hike, and they told me, there's a lot of pressure on us to open new hiking trails, and sometimes new four-wheel drive trails. And how can we do that in a way that will minimize the harm to wildlife? How can we manage it? Do we manage the amount? Do we manage the frequency of visitors? Are there areas where no way we should have trails, and other areas where it's fine, it doesn't do that much harm? And with this question, with designs, and we're still working on that. It's a work in progress, but already have yielded several results and fruits and decisions, by testing trails and experimentally checking how animal behavior and animals in general are affected by hikers in different intensities, in different numbers, in different areas, in different contexts. And already there are part of it. There's a nature park, for example, north of Israel, that we show that bicycle trails cause gazelles, which are endangered, to change their activity times. So they're overlapping much more with the predators, which impacts them. So already they basically cancel plans to build more bicycle trails in that park, and starting to designate area which is without trails as a refuge for the gazelles. And the successes are usually small and limited in scale, but there are still successes. And I think the key is to design it from the start with those who will use it.
Thank you, Oded. We have two more questions I'd like to address, at least one more, but we'll connect you in the discussion. I think that this question 4 about having one example, eventually I'll ask you guys to frame it in the other context of be patient, right? You needed 10, 20, 30 years to come up with some good examples. So our young scholars need to allow themselves time, I guess. So the question number 5, are there examples of behavioral interventions in which behavioral traits have been manipulated to address a condition concern? And since we're going to run out of time, I would just defer to the panel to choose whether we tackle number 5 or number 6. Number 6 is, we know that there are some excellent long-term data sets with behavioral data, plus more than 10 years, I'd say more than several generations. How can these data sets be useful to conservation? So can you guys decide which one takes one or the other?
Yeah, let's go to 5. And Alison.
Alison, number 5. Alison, you'll be chosen.
I second.
Great. Well, I'll say this from the perspective of a lot of the work that we do involves conservation breeding. And conservation breeding is really the last resort. If you can at all avoid having to bring animals into human care to breed them, it's better to conserve them in the wild and restore wild populations while you can, because there are a lot of challenges as soon as you bring an animal outside of their selective pressures, outside of their natural environment, and put them in human care. We do our best to try and replicate a lot of the same aspects of the wild environment so that we retain behaviors that we think are going to be survival relevant. But it's often a real challenge with these critically endangered species when you bring them into human care, because we often didn't know enough about their behavior in the wild before they get to the point of coming into our care. And so we're in this situation of trying to understand as best we can what types of cues are important for them. For instance, what are the cues that help them know it's time to breed? What is the diet they need to have? How much do they retain their foraging flexibility? What types of experiences do they need during development? These are all really important behavioral traits that are often environmentally linked that you, as somebody bringing an animal into human care, could miss. And so these conservation breeding programs often have to approximate. We do the best that we can. We can't recreate all of the cues out there to retain all of the behaviors. And one of the ones that Dan brought up earlier is anti-predator behavior. We know that in the absence of predatory challenges and exposure to predators, a lot of animals become naive to their predators. And they often need to be able to have targeted exposure to predatory cues in order to develop the whole suite of anti-predator behaviors. And those can include having direct responses to predators, but also other types of background behaviors that will make them more risk prone or risk averse. Basically, is it a safe environment or not? And so when we think about preparing animals for life in the wild, we have to think about what are the challenges that they are missing when they're in our care. So we often try and employ anti-predator training to make sure that they can have an opportunity to experience predatory cues. And depending on the species, we design that in ways that are most biologically relevant to that species. So for Alala, the Hawaiian crow, for instance, we present them with a wild, what seems to them to be a wild predator, their native predator, the Hawaiian hawk, alongside alarm cues of their own species and distress cues of their own species, so they can connect those two together in an aversive conditioning context. But we also have to think about what are the other challenges that they miss. Animals can miss foraging challenges, and there can be real important developmental windows where they need to have exposure to certain types of food that if they don't have that, they fail to gain a skill that could be necessary. And a very important part of that are social cues. So the social housing that you put animals in and in the ways in which you allow them opportunities to learn from experienced individuals can be really important for the maintenance of some of these survival relevant behaviors. So in that way, that behavior can be critically important when you bring animals into human care, and yet it is not everything. We still need to make sure we maintain the genetic health of a population you bring into human care. You have to make sure that any of the factors in the environment that cause them to decline in the first place have been addressed before you can release them. And that can often involve human-mediated problems. So we try and be very cognizant of the fact that we can solve one little piece of that puzzle, but actually the wider recovery of a species depends upon all those other factors being addressed there. I think I've taken us on a bit of a tangent here. Sorry, if anyone wants to add, please go ahead.
That's okay. What I would like to do now, we're almost at noon, and we understand that has been the case for many months or almost a couple of years after the pandemic, that some of our colleagues need to go at noon. So I think this is a good time just for us to transition from the somewhat organized set of questions that we gave the panelists to ponder and reflect on before meeting to thanking those of you who need to go to something else. We hope you can stay. If you can stay, what I would like to do next is really open the questions and answer session that has become so typical of the FINE seminar series. For those who are new to this, what we will do for the next hour is take questions from the audience. That includes you, if you're watching us through the YouTube channel. And what I ask that you do is that in the chatting window, just type a question mark, and I'll be calling you to ask the question, asking that if you can please let us know where you're joining us from and what's your institutional affiliation. If you are a student, or we'll make it broader, if you're an early career colleague, you decide if you're or not, we'll give you priority to asking questions. So just type an S. If you want to have your question directly addressed to one of the panelists, you'll have the chance to just direct your question to the panelists when I invite you to pose it. So with that, feel free to start typing question marks or S's into the chatting window. And I see that, okay, Adriana, thanks for helping me with instructions in the chatting window. And I see a question from Marion Dellinger, who tells us she's a student. Marion, welcome to the Fine, and please go ahead with your question.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for the very interesting discussion. My question is more directed, I guess, to Alison Greggor, because you explained that you started from like clearly academic research on like fundamental cognition and learning in birds, and you transitioned to like more applied and more general conservation. And I'm doing a PhD in cognition and personality in animals, and especially in fishes. And I was wondering how hard this transition was, because when I consider my perspectives for after my PhD, I'm always tending to think that like a PhD is so fundamental and so specialized and such a tiny niche study that I'm always afraid, like, how am I gonna use this like later to develop my career? So yeah, thanks for your answer.
Of course, thank you. I would say you actually end up doing several different things in your PhD. Yes, you become the world's expert in a very specific topic, but you are gaining a lot of transferable skills, critical thinking, abilities to combine information from different places, to think outside the box, to really plan a project in a number of steps. And these are skills that are really important in many fields outside of academia that you are still gaining and have a lot of experience with. For me personally, the journey into conservation was aided by the fact that I studied a specific set of species, and there was a conservation job that needed expertise in that species. So I studied corvids, and they needed somebody to help reintroduce the Hawaiian crow. So I could say, well, you know, even if my background hasn't been conservation biology so far, I can tell you a lot about crows and about crow learning, and we can figure out how to make that work. And then basically, you know, you can take one set of your skills and apply it. And so that was my avenue in. And then, you know, learning while I go, lots of fake it till you make it, trying to make sure that, you know, you really are trying to listen to other people who know more about certain areas of application, and being open to saying, hey, I don't know about, you know, that, but I can tell you my expertise in this, really can help open those doors. So there's no perfect line into conservation for you know, everyone takes a different route. And if you're interested in having applied effects in what you do, there's not one way to get into it. So that's my perspective on it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Eduardo, you're
Are you
muted.
still
Yes,
muted?
yes, sorry. So we're going to take first a question from the YouTube community. Adriana, you will help me with that. Then we'll go back to Carla. I forgot that you had asked a question early on. And after Carla, so that you know, so we go YouTube community, we go to Carla, and then we go to Rag, provided a student doesn't jump over the line. So Adriana?
Okay, so here's a question from Alice Gian. She's a student, I think. So it's for Alison. Do you have an example of anti-predator mimic device?
Was that, you said an anti-predator mimicking device?
Yes.
So that is often a question that comes up a lot when you don't have a social tutor. So for a lot of species, animals need to experience a conspecific reacting to in some way or giving some anti-predator cue in order to learn and associate that whatever predator they encounter is a danger to them. And so there are lots of ways to mimic a social cue if you don't have another conspecific there. You can use auditory cues, you can use chemical cues. It really depends on what is the important sensory experience for that species. What is the channel through which they usually learn and pay attention to conspecifics? We often get questions from managers saying, well, can't you just put it on a TV and play them a predation event and that just serve the purpose? And that's where for folks who study behavior can look at that and say, I can understand why that may seem like a really appealing prospect for humans who are so visually focused. But if you're dealing with a mammal, for instance, that really has more of an olfactory focus, that's not going to mean anything to them. And then, there's a lot of tests you have to do to make sure that whatever you are presenting to them is actually relevant to the sensory system of the species in question. So there is no one perfect anti-predator model. You really need to develop it for that species based on their sensory biases and how and when they learn about predation. I don't know if that answered, I don't know if I captured what the question was there, but hopefully
if I remember well from one of the papers you assigned, you were identifying sensory system knowledge as a huge area where we know so little for most wildlife. So let's go on to, there are no questions from students that I see. So Carla, you were asking how they define conservation, if I remember well, right? Carla? Clara, not Carla, I'm sorry, Clara.
Yeah, Clara B. Jones, social evolution, retired. I was just wondering how you are defining conservation, because it doesn't, as you're speaking, it doesn't sound like we, meaning behavioral ecologists, are trained to read the literature in conservation biology as it relies upon math and ecosystem ecology and the Lotka-Volterra equation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think John even suggested that most people don't read the literature. I'm thinking of, for example, Conservation Biology, the journal. I think a lot of people read the research papers in that journal. And I'm wondering how, if we're not trained to understand the literature, how can we contribute to conservation biology? That was long-winded. That's sufficient. I was wondering how you define conservation of biodiversity, for example, which I think is one of the major focuses of conservation biology.
So I wrote earlier on that when I use the word conservation, I like to think that we have too few of something, a small population paradigm, and we want more of them. But what we're talking about really is a much more inclusive view of conservation science that includes human-wildlife conflicts and what we might call wildlife management. And there, it's really, we perceive we have too much of something, or we have something in an area we don't want it to be in, and we need to come up with ways to sort of nudge animals out or reduce populations. And I think you're right that conservation scientists these days are trained in things that most, behavioral ecologists aren't trained in. If you want to contribute, you need to talk a vocabulary. You need to understand that vocabulary. You need to, even if you're not a master in that, everyone can't be a master of everything. You need to understand, most conservation scientists are concerned with counting things and numbers. And the geneticists and the genomicists have been very successful at sort of saying that we care about genetic diversity. Well, we care about a lot of diversities. There's many diversities we might care about. Genetic diversity is an important one, but so are others. Behavioral diversity, phylodiversity, other things. In any event, that field's had a large impact on what many people think is conservation. But at the end of the day, you're dealing with numbers of things, and you're dealing with where they are, and you're trying to sort of manage those. And I think there are many things. I mean, the favorite paper Alison, Oded, and I wrote a couple of years ago, it's my favorite paper in a long time, is this sort of new way of thinking about approaching and withdrawing as a foundational insight in managing wildlife-human interactions and managing wildlife. And that's ethological, man. And it's fun to think that through. And one of the things that none of us had said before, but I think is really important, is that one value we can do, once we understand what managers are tasked with in many cases sort of saying, well, I need a decision support tool. I need to know how to think about solving a problem. And, if we read the literature on decision support tools, and this is a huge intellectual challenge, coming up with bifurcating type trees, coming up with ways to make it easy, can this be useful, in a particular context, empowering managers to say, well, if this is a problem, maybe I do need to talk to a behavioral biologist. Maybe I don't, and I don't want to oversell anything. I'm completely agnostic. Behavior can be useful in some situations, and it's not going to be useful in other situations, or it's not going to be cost effective in other situations. What the four of us have been devoting a lot of our time to over the past, decade is to try to get it on the table and say, let's make sure people at least recognize that there are tools here. But there's other tools. If you go out and ask conservation biologists, practicing managers, what they want to learn, there's the known knowns and the unknown knowns. And the known known for them in many cases is we need to learn more social science tools. We need to understand how to work with stakeholders and rights holders. We want tools to improve that aspect of our interactions. But then there's the unknown knowns, things they don't know about that could be very useful. So we're working on this project we call the Integrative Conservation Clinic, which ultimately will be a one-stop shop that hopefully will create more integrative conservation solutions and thinking, and empower people to get information about the known knowns and the unknown knowns. I don't know if that answers the question.
I want just to add to that. I don't think it's so much the definition of conservation and how we defined it. It's about the fact that conservation is a multidisciplinary science. And being multidisciplinary means that it's not only that behavior ecologists won't necessarily know all about, and when you read conservation science papers, they won't necessarily know let's say the theory behind the science. Although again, many papers are very accessible, but not necessarily know how this or that research was done. But it's true for social scientists, psychologists that come to conservation from a different angle will not necessarily understand the genetics, and geneticists won't necessarily understand the population ecology. It's all, so first of all, it's about being open, but also about collaborating. When your project needs more than behavior, and every project in conservation will need not only, it cannot be only one angle to it. It will need a collaboration of angles. You need to collaborate with other scientists who are good at what they are doing, which is not behavior. And through this collaboration, you can be much, much more effective.
Am I hearing that you're suggesting?
Clara, if I may ask, we have lots, can you bear with me a little bit? We have many people who would like to also have a chance. So the next question is from Greg.
Hello, I am Raghavendra Gadakar from the Indian Institute of Science. I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, and my question is to any or all of the panelists. Implicitly or explicitly, all the last hour's discussion really concerned large animals, mammals, birds, so on. On the other hand, in recent years, we are experiencing and discovering massive loss of insect species, some cases 75%. Now, I study insect behavior, and the discussion got me thinking about whether insect behavior, knowledge of insect behavior would anyway be useful for conserving insect species. And any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think we should be taxonomically constrained. I think we should form, when I say the word wildlife, I mean any form of life. And that's not just necessarily animals too as well. I know this panel was put together about animal behavior and conservation, but I don't think we should be constrained to animals either. All forms of life are interacting with each other, and all forms of life show some degree of behavior. And behavior is really just how they're interacting with their world, whether it's other organisms or the physical environment around them. And so I think there's fundamental knowledge from all walks of life that I think can be useful for conservation in the end. So I totally agree with you that there is a huge taxonomic bias in the professional conservation world, I think for lots of reasons. But as scientists, I think many people can contribute. People who are studying fungi can be contributing, plants. People who are studying bacteria and viruses can be contributing.
Thank you, Joe.
I think that everything we talked about in the past hour, including the moving ecology, can be also applied to insects very easily. But there is, I agree with John, there is a bias. We talked about the importance of coming up with the questions, with the research question, with practitioners, with the conservation, with the people that need the solution. And yes, there is a bias a lot of time, both in scientists and in people doing conservation, that they're not necessarily thinking about the invertebrates or insects. It really depends. It's very much different from country to country, from organization to organization, and from person to person. But in that way, this is where we can contribute again as behavior ecologists and raise that issue as well, as we discuss, as we talk about priorities, as we talk about conservation needs with the conservation practitioners. And really, I think all the principles we talked about apply.
I would also say that, a lot of the country-specific biases there have to do with regulation as well. So in the United States, for instance, any resources going towards conservation are much more effective if they are channeled through the Endangered Species Act. And if you have species that are listed as endangered, and there are many fewer invertebrates that are listed as endangered compared to vertebrates. And partly that's public opinion, partly that's political will. There's a lot there that influences what we care about conserving as a society. And so conservation in some ways is a real philosophical issue as well. And so that's where being able to get people to care so they understand the reasons why it's important to save some of these less charismatic species is also really important. And that's something that researchers can do as well. If people understand more about what those species do that makes them unique and amazing and worth saving. So really that regulatory framework plays an important role there too.
That's another way where behavior can be of assistance, because, showcasing behavior of species that are maybe deemed as non-important for some people really help show how special they are and how important they are too. So again, another importance of behavior.
Adriana, we'll take a question now from YouTube.
Sure. Okay. So question from Claire O'Connell. She's a student. What jobs outside academia do you see as an useful avenue to pursue to be able to bridge research and conservation and management? And I think it's for anyone who wants to answer it.
I think there's a lot there. I wonder if the question is sort of outside of the professional conservation community. So the easiest way to answer that question is there's so many organizations that you could be employed at that enact conservation practice in some ways. So there are lots of NGOs. There's a lot of non-governmental organizations, basically not-for-profit types of organizations, like what Alison works for is part an NGO. There's lots of equivalent sort of governmental agencies, state and federal, that have mandates and requirements to look after the environment and wildlife. There's increasing number of private companies in this space too as well, whether they're the classic sort of environmental consultancy type of things, but increasingly many of the large, even Fortune 500 companies have significant wildlife related and sustainability related wings to them that you could work at and have a positive effect. I think the career tracks are enormous because the ways in which humans affect the environment are enormous. You could even go into finance and have a positive influence on conservation in some way. There's lots of ways that you can track patterns of behavior and consumption from humans to an effect on wildlife, and you can do something about that in the career track that you pursue. You don't just have to become an ecologist to have a positive influence on conservation.
Thank you, Joe. Karsten, you're next.
Yes, Carsten Schradin from the CNRS in Strasbourg, France, studying mammalian social evolution, currently in South Africa at the Succulent Karoo Research Station. Thank you for an amazing discussion of all the panelists about how to implement animal behavior in conservation. And several times, at least 3 of the panelists pointed out, the best way to do it is to know from the beginning what is the problem and to plan your research that can be implemented, which sounded a bit like applied research is more worthy like basic research. And then, of course, there came the question from the first student. I mean, you become the specialist how to implement this, and Alison had very good answers that the students do learn so much by asking principal questions that can be applied. But still, there's a lot of pressure on the students to be excellent in principal research, but then now also the next pressure, how can it be applied? And my question is, isn't it maybe one solution that within teams, let's say the Marmot project, the Old Monkey project, or any other project, to have students, some that focus really on the basic questions and some that focus more on applied questions in nature conservation instead of putting all on one shoulder. And then these students also interacting with each other can learn from each other in a way. And then the question is how to find which student to work in which of these areas, which one is better for applied questions and which one is maybe better to ask the principal the basic questions.
So I think that I'll take a stab at that. I think that, I think a number of us have been saying that you don't do everything at one point in your career, and that, I like to say learning behavior, looking at animals. I'm old fashioned, we use pens and papers a lot. And just sort of looking and trying to understand what animals are doing and learning how to think about them and learning the theories that behavioral biology broadly has to explain that, and thinking about mechanisms and studying mechanisms is a really important thing if you want to have insights, behavioral insights to apply to conservation. If you want to be a conservation scientist, that's a different training, and that's fine. But learning behavior can be really important. And long-term studies, I think, where people are looking at behavior over time, offer incredible opportunities to sort of get into a study where a lot potentially has been done in a lot of different ways, and to sort of begin thinking about mechanisms and function and adaptive value. At the end of the day, a lot of these conservation problems are about numbers. Behavior has fitness consequences. That's sort of, our day job, understanding some of those. And thinking about that, and these long-term studies in particular give you the opportunities to really think about that. Are there model systems? Yes and no. I think Tim and others have argued that you have to be really careful about model systems. Very closely related species can do things very differently. But the insights you get from working with large data sets from long-term studies, I think, can be really useful in giving people an opportunity to explore different dimensions of behavior and population biology, et cetera. So I don't know if it's about you have to sort of have an applied problem and a theoretical problem, and teams of people working on different things in the system. If that's an appropriate thing to do with your system, great. No one's particularly concerned about the yellow-bellied marmots going extinct. They're pretty, resilient. So I think I think the important take-home message is you don't have to do everything at once, and that there are opportunities to learn skills and dive down. And I channel my inner Mark Beckoff. watch your animals if you can.
One of the ways that I would address what Carsten you're saying, I think, is that the difference, I see sort of this as a pyramid where there's sort of basic foundational knowledge at the base and translational knowledge, then applied knowledge. And it gets narrower in the sense of the applied work is built on a larger set of translational work that is built on a larger set of basic and foundational work. And you need people working at all of those levels in some ways. I think part of what we've articulated is some of us have gone through a trajectory through that. Right now, I'm working more in this sort of applied space, but I spent a long time, decades, very much in the foundational sort of space. So I think you can structure teams in the ways that you have described, but I think it's also important to recognize that you can build on the foundations of work that's gone decades ago and jump straight into applied work if you want to, as long as you have sufficient basic foundational and translational work that the applied work can then use. And, you know, other programs like conservation evidence are sort of pulling that together. It's sort of pointing towards where you can use the information for conservation application. And a database like conservation evidence gives you that foundation of knowledge to then take an action from, if that helps as well. So I think you can just have students work on applied issues as long as you have the foundation underneath you.
I think the important here is to acknowledge that, and that's of the question, I think that there's a tension here, especially for early career researchers, between the needs and the demands of universities or usually academic institutes and the needs and of conservation organizations. And a lot of time they don't align. Again, it's context dependent, but a lot of time what academic institute, the demand of you does not fit into what you need to do if you want to be very applied or very helpful in conservation. And there are different strategies to deal with that in each one. I mean, so one of them is kind of like John said, I mean, start by doing what you need in order to advance and be more, I would say, toward the implied than the applied. You can do things that can be useful, but not directly necessarily, because you need to keep, to have model systems and large sample sizes, etc. Again, it still can be very useful, but more indirectly. And when we have 10 Europe, move more toward to applied. So that's one strategy. Another is, like you said, have both. Do some implied and some applied. Maybe other is, like Dan said, having long-term systems or having collaboration. And you can make it that your work will be both scientifically important and useful. Again, it has to do with the planning and the system, etc. But there is a tension there. There is, a lot of time what you need in order to advance in the academic ranks is not what conservationist or what is not what will give you conservation solutions to problems.
Thank you, Oded. The next question, Adriana, I think we go back to our YouTube colleagues.
There are no questions on the YouTube, no more, but we do have a student on the queue, Ana Maria. So we can
hold on, because I do know she's there, but let me see. Okay, yes, we can go to Ana Maria and then to Filippo. Ana Maria?
Yes, hi, my name is Ana Maria Romero. I'm currently an undergraduate student at Universidad del Rosario. And I have a question in relation with the importance or the priority that behavioral ecology has on conservation plans. Like, how do you think, in comparison to other fields or other research fields, behavioral ecology is in conservation plans?
I'm happy to take a crack at this. I'm sure we all have perspectives on it. So it depends what level of conservation planning you're talking about. We work very closely in what I do with endangered species recovery plans, and lots of people there might, often when you are describing a species and its reasons for decline, behavior is brought up, but it's not often linked upon heavily as a tool for recovery. People like to know what is the behavior of a species, what's their general behavioral ecology, for instance, their mating system, and whether or not they forage on lots of things, or they're a specialist forager. Those types of general behavioral categories are really common to see in trying to in recovery plans. But what you actually do with that is still behavior is not often considered to the same extent as other disciplines like genetics, where there different genetic units are used to describe populations that need conserving or trying to improve gene flow between different groups of animals. And so, but that doesn't mean it's not important. However, I think it's really valuable for those of us who study behavior to think about our applications within the ecosystem of existing solutions. So you may have a problem, and actually the solution is to build more fences and remove invasive rodents, and that may solve your problem. You may not need to do a whole other layer of behavioral interventions, but there may be other contexts in which behavior is really the key of why your traditional solutions aren't working. So that there are different ways in which in the planning process, if there is a need for behavior, it's wonderful to have that as a tool, but it's not often recognized that it's needed, and sometimes it's not needed. I don't know, Dan, Oded, or John, if you want to add to that.
Can you comment? Can I follow up quickly on? But I'm not convinced. In fact, I mean, genetics are considered needed, disregarding the fact that we have absolutely no knowledge of behavioral genetics, and the consequences on the animals we study are going to be contingent on how those sequences of T's and G's and C's that for some reason, I don't know how geneticists get away with this, we continue taking us as solid proof that these two things are different, but we do not. If we go back to what Dan said, of at the end of the day, we need to know who's going to mate, who's going to reproduce, and who's going to give us a next generation. That's where behavior comes in. And we still have this huge, it is easier to collect fecal samples and come back and do a whole genome sequence of anything these days than spend the whole day observing that animal behave. But really, selection is not occurring on this sequence of codes. Selection, and by that I mean what really matters to conservation, is occurring on the actual behavior. So the reason that it's not considered is because I think there's a misunderstanding of what most genetics are giving us regarding what matters, which is fitness and reproduction and survival.
There are certain contexts in which that is very clear. In conservation breeding, for instance, we can come up with genetically compatible pairings as much as we want, but if there's not behavioral compatibility between individuals, you're not going to get breeding. And so we often have to think about tactics such as giving animals opportunities for choosing mates, so that we can give them a genetically appropriate pool of individuals and then let them pick the most behaviorally compatible one in order to actually get them to breed. Because you're right, genes aren't everything. They do still, however, play a really fundamental role currently in how conservation is planned. And whether or not populations are seen as distinct, worth conserving on their own, whether or not there are going to be whatever, regardless of the behavioral mechanisms underpinning that, the current landscape and reality is that the genetics is still heavily used in conservation planning.
I think the question is not whether genetics is more important or behavior is more important, because the answer is obviously depending on the system and the question and the plan. I think the complaint here maybe is that genetics has historically had a better PR than behavior. So they've been used more regardless whether they're more important or not. And sometimes they are more important. And to a certain degree, I agree. So part of our job is to improve the PR of behavior. So it can be considered not as better than genetics or any other consideration. As we said, conservation is very multidisciplinary science, but that it will be considered among them, and and each one of them will be considered what is the contribution of that knowledge to our specific or particular plan.
I think there's an element of history too as well. for conservation. That if you look at the science roles in a lot of conservation NGOs, there's a lot of landscape ecologists who are essentially counting critters at a very large scale. And there's a bunch of lab scientists who are running tests on things, whether that's genetic tests or physiological tests. There's very few behavioral ecologists. And so I think it's generally not considered because of the historical staffing of conservation organizations, even though behavioral information is thoroughly baked in, but people just aren't realizing it. I mean, some of the examples that Alison was giving as she was answering this question about, just fundamental behavioral ecology of the species, those landscape ecologists are not calling it behavioral ecology, but they are actually using that information. And I think the difficulty comes when you're trying to design an action, an actual intervention in sometimes, and designing that around behavior. I think conservation organizations are uncomfortable with that because they don't understand it. They don't understand behavior as a characteristic and a trait. It's just something the animal does and they could do anything. And so genetics is easy because you can read it. Landscape ecology is easy to understand because you can count the critters on that remote sensed image. The habitat is easy because you can see it. Behavior is not, because it's very transient and flexible.
You're saying they don't understand behavior. Isn't it the case that they misunderstand genetics?
Yes, there's probably some of that too as well. I didn't want to dive into that, but I think that there is a general lack of historical understanding and training about fundamental behavioral ecology among people who are professionals in the conservation community. So part of what we could do as a community is help them understand the relevance of behavior. So other than research enterprises that we can enter into, we can also get into sort of co-educational enterprises too as well, and help them understand that really understanding animals' behavior and how they sense their environment and how they respond to it is fundamental to many of the parameters that conservation organizations are interested in tracking and ultimately influencing.
So no one said this word yet. In the Anthropocene, one of the key questions we face really is centered on the limits of plasticity. And plasticity can be genetic or phenotypic. Phenotypic plasticity, and what we're looking at is behavior, right? So you need to understand both. Is there an evolutionary potential, which is a quantitative genetic question? Can animals sort it out themselves, which is a behavioral question? And that's a full employment scheme. And that, by the way, is a full employment scheme for conceptual advances in and using long-term data sets. Because, we might have the genealogies, we might have those deep pieces of information. A lot of the flight initiation distance literature, for example, looks at phenotypic plasticity, but is unable to look at, genetic plasticity, evolutionary potential. Yet we need to understand both of these if we're to really understand the limits of plasticity in the Anthropocene, which is an epoch where we're causing a lot of changes that are creating lots of mismatches. So here, I actually argued for genetics. Go figure.
Yeah, thank you. Filippo, you're next.
Thank you very much. I'm Filippo Aureli from Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. And my question is basically a bit related to everything you've been talking in the last few minutes by chance, because I didn't plan it. But let's say I take the last point that Dan mentioned about there is genetics and behavior. Actually, I think the genetics he talks is the behavior as well. You need to see the expression of the genotype in the phenotype anyway. So I think it's behavior both ways. So I go with Eduardo that I think is much more important to focus on the behavior, then we can study the causes. And this links a bit also with Karsten was talking about how to involve the student. And I think Dan mentioned a couple of times, and my question is basically try to have the panelists answer the question, the sixth question that was on the list about the long-term studies and the importance of the long-term studies. Because I think any student that goes into a team could actually be aware of the importance of the little work that each of us are doing if we put in a perspective of this long-term project with all those sort of different specification of small little project, but the overall will bring to conservation a kind of a database. So my question is basically the sixth question for the hosts and the students have prepared, but I don't think it was asked, because there are some excellent long-term data set with behavioral data, and how can these data sets be used to conservation? Dan mentioned it a couple of times, so I'm sure you can expand on that, but the question is for everybody, of course.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it a couple of times, and I think that it can be through training, it can be through deep knowledge, it can be through capacity building, it can be through thinking about limits of plasticity, it could be thinking about just developing ways to think about things that you can actually test, because if you're dealing with something that's endangered, you don't have a lot to work with in some cases. Yet maybe you can develop proof of concept in something that's a little more common, whether it works or doesn't work in another case, maybe useful or not. But what do other people think?
Do we have anyone who wants to follow up with Dan, or if not, we have a question?
Yeah, I mean, Dan is our representative of having a long-term, really long-term study system. But or continuing what he said about what Dan said about plasticity. I mean, thinking about conservation challenges, our world is changing, and it's changing fast. So there's nothing more compatible than a long-term view of a system, how it reacts to these changes. And of course, it will be different from system to system, but to get a perspective that can be very relevant to conservation. And that's the plasticity question. But in general, that's plasticity and all of the mechanism of plasticity and the implications and sometimes where there's no plasticity. Okay, what are the implications of the changes? How do they change the social structure? How do they change the fitness? How do animals that cannot, for example, react, will they respond? Also, I think that in a way, a long-term system have the opportunity to translate or their finding in a Danny wants to say, but translate in a better, more easily.
So Zelena was asking for concrete examples, and here's a concrete example. So Social's on my lower left screen, and we're working, and she's working on developing a way to think about cumulative adverse impacts. And we're using, in some cases, 60 years of data or 20 years of data, but you can't really do that easily necessarily and go out and have the depth of the demographic knowledge and the meteorological knowledge and the behavioral knowledge to sort of look at things that have fitness consequences and trying to put them together and develop an index. And what we're showing is that this can be useful for some questions and maybe not others. What does that mean? Well, I think we're dealing with, in many cases, a death by 1,000 cuts. And we all have our perfect and favored impact that we want to look at, but really a cumulative impact, a cumulative adversity perspective may be more meaningful for some questions. Is that possible to ask in certain contexts? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And we're still struggling to articulate the value of this for conservation management, but it's sort of a proof of concept way of thinking about things that actually provides more traction onto some fitness consequences than not. And since a lot of conservation problems, as I keep reiterating, are, you got too few of something and you want to figure out how to keep a population up, that this might be very useful.
Thank you, Dan. We have a question from a student. I think your name is Jasmine, if I'm pronouncing it well. Are you still there, Jasmine Gabamian?
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you.
If you can tell us where you're joining us from and your institution.
Yes, I'm from University of California, Davis. I'm a PhD student, and my topic area is personality and cognition in gray wolves. And my question is more so regarding the human-wildlife conflict. If we haven't touched on this a little bit, but since my key study species is an apex predator, and I wanted to know if you could expand on, anyone in the panel could expand on communicating with stakeholders, especially with the public, as far as this expanding this coexistence with predators, because I know that there's non-lethal tools for management and lethal tools of management, and regarding like culling of individuals, which is actually causing a lot more problems behaviorally in these wolves. So I wonder if you could speak more on the communication with the public and how you get like the importance of your research across to just a wider audience.
I like to say that I was at Yale years ago for a workshop on predation and predators, and I was like the prey guy. And the introductory talk was from Dan Ash, who at the time was head of Fish and Wildlife Service. And I thought that, and the doors were closed, and I'm like, this guy's quitting tomorrow. We're going to read about this in the New York Times, because he was honest. And he said, and this honesty from a high-level official was like striking to me. And he said, you know, we worried about the wolf behavior, but that was a huge mistake. The wolves figured it out themselves. This whole project failed because, and this is Yellowstone reintroduction, this whole project failed because we didn't worry enough about the human behavior. All of our conservation problems are in this nexus that, you know, that works between humans and wildlife and nature. All of it depends on what we think. All of it depends on attitudes. One of my PhD students, Kat Hernandez, is working on developing a model for thinking about narrative. Our stories we tell about things influence behavior. Animals respond to this. This changes interactions with people, which changes narratives. And she's like a science fiction writer in addition to sort of being a biologist. So she's really going a deep dive into narrative theory, but also in thinking about movement ecology. So I think that we absolutely, from a conservation scientist perspective, need to, you know, put the people in the system and need to understand the people. And that's an interesting, you know, predicament. Rights holders and stakeholders, you know, may have opinions. And I think that we need to understand those. We need to come up with joint solutions. And to be a bit controversial, I'll say some of those solutions may not necessarily, or some of those attitudes and desires may not necessarily be congruent with biodiversity conservation in a particular manner. And that's a challenge I think we face to try to acknowledge, respect, and understand. And I don't know the answer to that. You know, who is a rights holder? How do you define that? Who is a stakeholder? I mean, anyone can be a stakeholder. You know, lobbyists are stakeholders. So I you know, this is the, and you've heard me say conservation science repeatedly, because it's not simply the biology. It's clearly not just the behavior or the animal behavior. It's the human behavior. You know, we need to change human behavior in various ways to achieve successes in conservation and management. And it's the perceptions of things that really drive a lot of stuff. So we need to understand this, and we need to think about behavior change models, not just for animals, but for people too.
I have an even more extreme view on this, I think, in terms of the role of humans. I think humans have to be absolutely centered for conservation to be effective. We're the problem, but we're also the solution. And I think conservation is actually more of a humanistic social science that's informed by other sciences. I don't think it's a science in itself necessarily. It depends on how you define science, I guess. So I think in your particular case, Yasmin, I think really understanding the culture around the different kinds of constituents that you want to have coexist with the wolves is paramount. You probably don't need to know that much more about wolves, but you need to know an awful lot more about people, likely, is part of the answer. And so that gets scary for people who are coming from an ecology background, because it means learning different disciplines. And I think this gets back to the very first question that Clara asked too as well. Conservation is a very multidisciplinary applied practice. And that's challenging because then we have to push ourselves to be learning different things all the time. So just, you know, I'm old and gray, and just in the last 10 years, I've had to learn a whole bunch of sociology, anthropology, business enterprise work to be able to do conservation effectively. But my training has nothing to do with that, my formal training. So I think seeing the opportunity there by the challenge of forcing yourself into these more humanistic areas of study, I would sort of recommend to think to you. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do all of the work. It may be collaborations that can help you along the way too as well. Maybe there's a conservation psychology unit or a bunch of ethnographers in an anthropology department that you could work with that will really help you understand the sort of the incentives and the rationales for why people hold certain beliefs about the wolves and take certain actions.
Thank you. I think I'm next with a question, and I'm glad it's coming to the end because I've been thinking a lot, listening to you all. And I wanted to ask you, in part because I've been thinking along this hour and a half, but I have thought about this in the past. It may have been Karsten left. I don't remember if what I'm going to say comes from something he shared with me or I discussed with him. But when I'm listening to you all, and we through the panel, getting back to really thinking conservation biology, applied behavioral ecology, I was thinking continuously about how we went about the pandemic. So we had in 2 years, I'm wondering how you react to this, that we had in 2 years with the pandemic, a very fast-paced development of what conservation biology crisis, if you allow me to say it so, has happened over 20 years. Because with the pandemic, we had the people who had done before the foundational work for us to understand virus diversity, microbiology, you define it. They never went out of the lab. So somehow we found ourselves with the need to really bring that foundational knowledge to very applied context with all the complexities. And so many things you were saying relate to how we went all together across the world through the pandemic. And I wonder if we have seen anyone comparing those two to learn from how we handle the pandemic. I mean, we were just talking about the wolves, right? And it wasn't enough to have a vaccine that was deemed successful in the lab. Now you need to convince people, and different people, different cultures, different languages, all kinds of things that are so similar in my mind to what we've been discussing here for an hour and a half. Only that we are allowing ourselves several decades. Hopefully we won't get to the point where we need to resolve some issue related to conservation biology in 24 months, like we did with the pandemic. But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on this that I'm sharing.
I'll have a stab at going first. Part of what you were talking about, Eduardo, reminded me of one of my past lives. I did usability focused type research for technology companies. And I think part of what you're hitting on is that for something to go from theory and fundamental knowledge to actual practice, it has to be both useful and usable. And we sometimes stumble in those areas. We can design something that is useful, addresses the issue, but people don't adopt it because it's not actually usable. It doesn't make sense to them in the context of how they were going to use that piece of information or that product or something. So for example, there's vaccine resistance because different countries, it's been politically aligned and so on. We didn't get ahead of the usability question part. And I think in conservation, we also struggle with that sometimes. We can generate useful information that's very relevant, but we don't pay enough attention to the usability transferal to actually influence behaviors sometimes.
Would you add to the usability and the urgency, the concrete, tangible outcome? Because that's what we've had with the pandemic in 2 years, that so many people don't realize we're having, because maybe it's developing slower in the kind of conservation. So we're not seeing things happen to a point that are affecting us directly on a daily basis.
I think there is a huge communications issue for the biodiversity crisis. I mean, if you talk to most people on the street, they have no idea what the biodiversity crisis is at all, but most people will know about climate change. That's both bad and good in the sense that we have yet to mess up the communication about the biodiversity crisis in the same ways that we've messed up the communications about climate change. If we can position solutions to the biodiversity crisis in a way that actually resonate with people in a positive way, and say that these are the kinds of things that we can do to enable improvements in people's lives while also saving and protecting biodiversity will do far better than the scare tactic communications that's happened around climate change, where then you get huge amounts of denial and strong resistance that then gets politically aligned. So I think we're in a position where we really need very strategic communications about biodiversity to be able to make the kind of actions that I think you're thinking about, because we are in a crisis, and just as much as it is with climate change. But the public don't know that, and there's not the political will because the public doesn't know that.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes. Let me see if we, oh, no, Jasmine, you've already asked your question. We don't have any more questions in the chat. So we can take, it's already 5 to the hour. So usually what we do now, since we have no more questions, we thank those of you who join us through the YouTube channel. We hope you'll join us again next week when Damian Farin presents his talk. Everyone is welcome. Remember that access to the Zoom link is free. There's no password, there's no firewall. You just click there and join us if you would like to do that. If not, you're more than welcome to join us again via the YouTube channel. So with that, I think I'll stop the live streaming. And those of us here in Zoom, we can take a few more